from Barbara Blewster.
Thank you.
Thanks, Barbara.
Thank you. Thank you. The title of my talk tonight is Our Fabulous American Culture, the Past, Our Hurting American Culture, the Present. Several years ago, a friend of mine said, "How can you love this country?" It was such a shocking comment to me. I thought, well, first place, I'm 20 years older than he is. That might explain a little, and so I said, because I know what it was. And so I thought, later on, subsequently, I called BYU and I said, do you have any books on what was great American culture? And they couldn't recommend anything to me. There were a couple others I have gathered since then. But essentially, our great American culture, and there's certainly a good residue still left, are the Christian principles with which this country was founded. And so what are they? Number one, you love God and Jesus Christ. You honor your parents. You love your neighbor. You do not bear false witness. You keep the Sabbath day holy. And the ethic that you do not work, if you do not work, you do not eat, was a strong part of our pioneer Christian communities, along with a strong sense of charity and helping. So let's review a little bit. In 1620, the Mayflower brought 102 pilgrims to Plymouth. Before they debarked, they signed the Mayflower Compact, which stated, "In the name of God, amen. Having undertaken for the glory of God in the advancement of the Christian faith, we combine ourselves together into a civil body politic for furtherance of the ends aforesaid." The ends were advancement of the Christian faith. Well, Governor Bradford and Sir William Brewster, both on the Mayflower, earned theological degrees from Cambridge. No doubt the others were tutored in scriptures on the voyage, but they all wanted religious liberty. After the first year of communal living and the death of one half the pilgrims, Governor Bradford thereafter allowed each man to keep the parcel of land he wanted, and then free enterprise was born. He declared Thanksgiving in 1623. It was, to William Bradford, a more sacred holiday than Christmas because Christmas had been paganized or had traditions that he didn't think were very much in. They were just switched a little bit. Well, that was 1620. A few years later, John Winthrop, president of the Massachusetts Bay Company and educated in theology, brought 1,000 people to Boston. From Boston and Plymouth, other colonies formed, usually from a religious leader who took his following and started what was called a ward or a township. The self-evident needs of survival required self-reliance, hard work, competition, cooperation, and constantly learning. Every 4-year-old knew they were of worth in their home. Well, after the breaking off from Boston and Plymouth and starting new townships, each township was sort of set the moral standard for the town. And remember, it was headed by a theological person, somebody who had a degree in theology, or usually was a leader of a Christian group. I did want to tell you about William Penn, though, who came about 60 years later. He had a charter from the king for Pennsylvania. He came in 1682. He was tolerant of other religions. Pennsylvania's Constitution says, "Men being born with a title to perfect freedom and uncontrolled enjoyment of all the rights and privileges of the law of nature, no one can be put out of his estate and subjected to the political view of another without his consent." One of the amazing things about William Penn was that he bought, even though he had a charter from the king for Pennsylvania, nevertheless, When he got to Pennsylvania, he he bargained, or he didn't bargain, he bought land from the Indians that were there. And his relationship with the Indians was outstanding. It was better then than 100 years later. Nevertheless, they had problems with people trying to sell liquor to the Indians, and he discouraged that a lot. But remember, Philadelphia was the city of brotherly love, and it began with William Penn and his attitude towards other people. Well, ladies and gentlemen, morality stems from the top down. Our civic and university founders were learned in theology and were the lawyers of the day. Universities were private institutions. Now get this, John Harvard began Harvard in 1636. Harvard's statement of principles required every student to read scriptures twice a day and give accounting of his studies. The purpose was to earnestly consider the end of your life. And all students for a couple of hundred years were taught, number one, there is a God. Number two, you are accountable for your life on this earth when you die. And hence, there was what will be talked about is your self-control, self-regulation. In 1690, Connecticut law declared that all parents and masters must teach their respective children and servants to read in English and to read scriptures. Over the next several decades, theological lawyers, founded universities. Here are some of the universities founded on these principles. Now, universities and hospitals were privately funded, and mostly by churches. So the William and Mary, 10 theologians founded Yale, Princeton, Dartmouth, and King's College, and King's College subsequently changed to Columbia, named after Columbus, by the way. Listen to this requirement for admission into King's College. No candidate shall be admitted into the college unless he shall be able to render, translate into English the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, from the Greek. That was to enter. Those are very high standards reflective of what young people are capable of learning. And even though they had to travel without cars and without electricity. There was no separation between church and state. However, it's interesting because in England, taxes paid the clergy. But it's Patrick Henry that fought a big lawsuit that did not allow, especially in Virginia, not to allow taxes to pay clergy. And there you had a separation. This brings to mind what Joseph Stalin, one of his principles of communism, or taking over a country, says, tell a lie often enough, it becomes fact in the public mind. We have had a lie drummed into us long enough. It's time for us to stand up everywhere we can and say, we are a Christian nation. We were founded as a Christian nation. The ward or township those people were very vigilant about the moral standards. Swearing and smoking were evils punished by fines. Sodomy was punishable by death. Townships took on the charity needs and standards of their communities. So they were very careful about anybody who was lazy. In fact, they said, laziness is a form of fraud. Do we like that? Laziness is a form of fraud. American culture and prosperity is reflected in our Christian heritage. We are given gifts to create and have ideas unique to ourselves. I like this cute quip, be yourself, everybody else is taken. So, develop you. That's rather a major point. Intelligence is given to each of us. Let us use our minds and not be light-minded. I get really annoyed with the lack of any kind of meaty conversation among so many people. You might feel the same. Well, I think one of the great things is this individualism, and so I want to give a couple of examples of that are rather choice, really, and that helped America and the spreading of this greatness. I love the story of Cyrus McCormick, who invented the reaper. He hated seeing his family's slaves work so long and hard. At the 1850 London's World Fair, the reaper was the only American exhibit. We were laughed at for having such a sparse contribution. However, the reaper was demonstrated and harvested 20 acres in a day. It was then the highlight of the fair. John Deere, early on, invented the plow, began as a blacksmith, and improved the lives of thousands, because over time he made many, many big advances in the plow. And it was really in the late 1800s that there was a steam-powered plow. But he encouraged better steel manufacturing, so he went to Pittsburgh so that he could insist upon better steel, and so he didn't have to import it from England. Thomas Edison, by being homeschooled, as you probably already know, was free to pursue his genius. In his 84 years, he had 1,093 patents. When we remember Edison, we mustn't forget old Ben Franklin and his discovery of electricity, and recognized what he had. He had energy and power in that electricity. Booker T. Washington is one of my favorites, and his book, Up From Slavery, should be read by everyone. How many of you have read Up From Slavery? Have any of you read it? Well, in there he talks about, he said, when history is truly written, there will be recognition given to the wealthy white widows that came down and set up private schools for the poor black children that needed to learn to read. And I want to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, the black people went within 100 years, from 1865 to 1965, from 0% literacy to 95% literacy. That's amazing. And not only that, they had private homes with running water and electricity and refrigerators and stoves, and just like the rest of us do. They also had more higher percentage going to college and having their churches than any other group of people in the world except Caucasian America. They have done beautifully, and we're grateful for that. But it's Christianity and the free enterprise system. Oh, and my goodness, George Washington Carver was a devout man. He said the Lord didn't give him a very big brain, but it was big enough for the peanut. He invented over 300 things with the peanut, including paper from the shells and the skins, if you can imagine, but all kinds of paint, and as well as cookies and peanut butter and candies and all the things. He also had a way to grind up the peanut and put it over sweet potatoes so it would taste a little bit like fried chicken. Well, intelligence is infinite. Now I want you to remember that. Intelligence is infinite if we just keep government out of the way. With government out of the way, America created the 5,000-year leap in every way. We live with equal to 40 servants as compared to our founders' era. I am skipping over the fabulous Revolutionary War, the Declaration of Independence, and the Constitution, except to mention that the sterling character of George Washington has permeated our society. At least it permeated me. The brilliance and the sacrifices of John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, and then of our explorers, Lewis and Clark and Jedediah Smith. And we really can't forget Brigham Young either. But we need to know our children and grandchildren, everybody we touch, needs to know of these great events because they're individuals. In 1831, Alexis de Tocqueville, the French philosopher visiting America, concludes that a firm adherence to religious morality is the built-in check that keeps political government from overstepping its bounds and its citizens self-regulated. And that is the key. We all must stay self-regulated. One time Shane said, don't we want rulers to obey the laws? Want them, the rulers, to obey the rules? And that's what we need to do too. And it's exactly right. In those days, we didn't have income tax. Hospitals and universities were privately funded and therefore were run very efficiently and very well. And people pooled their resources for some of the technology they needed at the time. I want to include a bit of music in this presentation just to remind you. Musical instruments were rare in the 1600s in New England, but one could hear families singing psalms. Isn't that interesting? Dancing and balls were discouraged in Pennsylvania, but were popular in the South. We know that by the 1700s, there were many instruments, the violin, the piano, guitars, were plentiful in the West. In fact, my dad in 1963 bought a ranch in northeastern Oregon in the Wallowa Mountains, and there were some homestead houses still on the ranch, and we found up in the rafters an organ somebody had carried across something. But when I look at those homestead houses, I think, oh my goodness, finding water, just growing things to survive, it just sort of boggles the mind. Well, briefly, let us remember uplifting, fabulous music of our American culture. Now, I mention this because the Muslim and Hindu and Eastern cultures don't begin to have music like we do. Europe brought us the great classics, that's for sure. But we have great additions to that. Hymns are Negro spirituals. Stephen Foster, the sun's so hot I froze to death, Susanna, don't you cry. Isn't that fun? Such fun words. The Mormon Tabernacle Choir, all the college choirs, the Whiffenpoofs, I don't know if you all know about the Whiffenpoofs, the boys' choirs. Then we had the great bands, the Duke Ellington, Tommy Dorsey, Glenn Miller, Artie Shaw, the composers, Cole Porter, Richard Rodgers, George Gershwin. We have a son that wants his children to know all the musicals from the 50s, and they should be in our libraries as well, because they are great American culture, as long as it lasted. Watch out, 60s, here we come. But this is interesting because Martin Luther's school in Germany, the original Martin Luther, music was second only to theology in importance because it reflects order and mathematical harmony. On April 15th, 1775, the shot was fired at Lexington and Concord, and it was known as the shot heard round the world. Well, that phrase meant that every king and potentate knew that if the Americans won their war for independence, their elitist game was up. So on May 1st, 1776, Adam Weishaupt began the Illuminati officially. Now, the term Illuminati should ring bells to you some way, because always the conspiracy has these terms, and similar to that. This Illuminati has gone forward, and this is what we'll describe now some. The goal was to infiltrate America to destroy Christianity, to create a dependence upon government, and not have faith in God. One of the first bills that the first Congress passed was the Northwest Ordinance. Article 3 of the Northwest Ordinance was to the standards by which other states would come into the Union. The Northwest Ordinance in Article 3 says, religion, morality, and knowledge being necessary for the happiness of mankind, schools and the means of education shall forever be encouraged. Now that's really important. The first word there is religion, morality, and knowledge. Up until about 1875, those words were used in the constitutions of every new state that came into the Union. I think Kansas was about the last. Our Christian culture has been switched. Now, instead of the natural man being an enemy to God, it is that man is born good. He does not need the 10 Commandments, and man does not need the atonement or rules, except from government when he goes astray. Karl Marx published the Communist Manifesto in 1948, and Friedrich Nietzsche in Germany declared, God is dead. These atheistic creeds were expounded upon and pushed among our intellectuals. The great shift was from the intellectuals of our early days and what they taught in the universities and how that carried on to about 1870s, but it takes a while for it to penetrate. A great motivation among the elitists was sexual freedom. They did not want accountability to God for their actions. Immorality is a big tool today in order to be advanced in some occupations and accepted in the very inner circles of the elitist power. Consider the number of murders that are associated with the Clintons and how they have been protected in spite of the evidence. A few of those were Vince Foster, James McDougal, Ron Brown. There are about 20 murders connected with them. And they're not the only ones. The change was also from the creator to the created, to worship Mother Earth, the New Age movement, or the Age of Aquarius, and to worship reason. In fact, in France, there's a statue to Mother Reason. Our culture over time has transitioned from faith in God to faith in entitlements. Entitlements are simply theft, or as Bastiat would say, legalized plunder. In the 1870s is when Harvard and Yale and the rest of the Ivy Leagues converted from schools to train ministers to secular universities, focusing on socialism. This is because some of the greatest science was going on in Germany, and Germany most of their professors were very socialistic, and a whole talk could be given on what the Frankfurt School did when it came here. The shift was from individualism to mass culture, groupthink, be like everyone else. And we are all responsible for the less fortunate by compulsion rather than individual charity freely given and individual responsibility. So the shift from our once glorious Christian culture to paganism has been orchestrated and pushed by conspiracy and advanced by many intellectuals who are themselves victims of it. Obviously, liberals promote each other into positions. Several years ago, like 35, I asked Frank Meyer, who was a writer for National Review, I asked him, why do so many liberals, why are professors so liberal? And he says, because we think we're smarter than everybody else and we can run your life. Makes sense, doesn't it? Except they can't. In the 20s and 30s, novelists and playwrights centered in New York's Greenwich Village were adherents to socialism, anarchism, and communism. They include most of the writers who constitute the standard canon of American literature for college students. Now, these were all socialists and communists as I read their names. You'll like some of their literature, nevertheless, at least I do. Theodore Dreiser, George Bernard Shaw, Eugene O'Neill, Carl Sandburg, John Dow Passos, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Ernest Hemingway, Sherwood Anderson, Sinclair Lewis, Jack London, and Upton Sinclair. The publishing houses, as well as NBC, CBS, and ABC, the wire services, were all run by socialists and communists. Well, in 1940, George Orwell stated the following. It's an amazing quote. For 200 years, we sawed and sawed and sawed at the limb we were sitting on. And in the end, much more suddenly than anyone had foreseen, our efforts were rewarded, and down we came. But unfortunately, there was a little mistake. The thing at the bottom was not a bed of roses, after all. It was a cesspool full of barbed wire. Pretty graphic. Timelines show a progressive pattern because we face a conspiracy. Nothing happens in politics by accident. It is all carefully planned and planned out a long time in advance. So in 1913, what a watershed year. With the Federal Reserve and the income tax and the direct election of senators. Those are things that need to be reversed. In 1922, Margaret Sanger launched Planned Parenthood. Also in 1922, the Council on Foreign Relations was founded. Now that is kind of the head that we say there are gods and there are demigods. The demigods are who you see, the president. The gods are the ones behind them. And that's what the CFR fits in, Council on Foreign Relations. They began in 1922. And the Carnegie Endowment, they were founded, a lot of them were all part of the big foundations with very wealthy people. The Carnegie Endowment took on perverting the universities and our educational system. And those are talks for another time. But we can see the results. In 1945, the U.S. joined the United Nations to keep us out of war. So far, the U.S. has been involved in 50 wars or police actions, spilling the blood of our boys and the boys of other countries. And what follows are a plethora of Supreme Court decisions that were outside the authorization of the Constitution. In '62, the court declared school-sponsored prayers unconstitutional. Segregation was declared unconstitutional. In '65, Ed Sullivan lauded the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, Elvis, and the drug culture, and dissident music was well on the way. A succession of hard rock was on the way. Ed Sullivan also promoted Fidel Castro and declared him the George Washington of the Sierra Maestra. In the 60s, the civil rights movement, funded by the Ford Foundation, has created havoc among our black families. One black lady exclaimed that the Ku Klux Klan could never have done to the black families in terms of destroying families and destroying their Christian base as the civil rights movement had. In 1970, Nixon takes us off the international gold standard, in which this is the beginning of a lot of inflation. In 1973, Roe versus Wade passed. Abortions mushroomed to 300,000 per year, with taxes paying the bill and extra profit from baby body parts. At the same time, our youth have had too much luxury and have boring school curriculums. A natural result is the loss of respect for religion and family traditions. And then in 2012, Obamacare is declared constitutional, which it isn't, and the Supreme Court declares sodomite unions legal. I refuse to call them marriages or use the word gay, which means happy. Theirs is not a happy lifestyle. It is a death lifestyle in two directions. It mocks God, it rapes children, some eventually practice bestiality, and there will be some that practice cannibalism. And now the head of the army is a sodomite. Our cesspool of barbed wire. All right, what are we going to do about this? Well, I'm not in the Birch Society to roll over and die, or just say it's too late. With boldness and humility, we must be able to defend and be dedicated to our religion and repent and encourage other Christian leaders to join us. I think a key is keeping the Sabbath day holy. I think it's very important for us to keep the Sabbath day holy. I have no doubt providence will help us as we repent and keep the Sabbath day. I say join the John Birch Society. That doesn't take away from tea parties. But we cannot save Western civilization against organized evil if we are not educated and organized to do so. It is the only organization that has the education on all subjects, the tools, and the program. The address is jbs.org. Ladies, offer to teach manners and good literature, music and art everywhere, to our families, in prisons, in churches, in schools, in community centers, in scout groups, in our neighborhood. Manners are minor morals. Culture and manners go together. I have to tell you very quickly that with all the grandchildren that we have, I had a family of grandchildren over for dinner. Now, I make sure that everything is very lovely. If it's wintertime, we have candlelight. We have my nice china and silver, classical music on. And one little grandson said to his mother, you know, going to Grandma's is a little bit like going to heaven. I never expect such a great thank you as that one was, but that was really neat. But I do try and make manners. In fact, they said, Grandma is full of manners, but Grandpa is more fun. So that's the other side of that coin. Encourage homeschooling. Simultaneously, help teachers teach the Constitution and our great American culture. And Sarah Rouse over here has done a fabulous job in putting a curriculum together to teach the Constitution to students. And it is fabulous. I encourage all of you who have not taken her class on how to teach it to do so, and to promote her teaching or having her teachers go teach in the schools that your children are connected with. I think also the Constitution, we all need to memorize Article 1, Section 8. We need to be very familiar with what the Constitution says. Now, I want to close by quoting John Adams. This quote chokes me up a lot of times. Posterity. You will never know how much it costs the present generation to preserve your future, your freedom. I hope you will make good use of it. If you do not, I shall repent in heaven that ever I took half the pains to preserve it. God bless America.
Thank you so much, Barbara, for what you do. We really appreciate it.